First, please tell us who you are and what your role has been in the League of Women Voters.
I'm Nancy Tate. I'm a longtime member of the Arlington League of Women Voters, now the Arlington and Alexandria City League of Women Voters. I am currently the chair of the History Committee. I have also been the president of this local league and on the board of directors. But in addition to that, for 15 years, I served as the executive director of the National League of Women Voters, which we refer to as the League of Women Voters of the United States. I got involved in the year 2000, which happened to be just a few months before the whole election meltdown of election 2000.
Yeah.
I was just happened to be changing jobs. I didn't realize what I was getting into. But those years ever since, of course, seen more challenges and changes to the election system than we'd seen in years. Americans took for granted our election system and thought everything was routine and so forth. And we saw how things can turn out quite differently depending on the details of the operations. And since the League operates at all levels, federal, state, and local, League people are at the local level and have long been observers and know where some of these issues are and work with the election offices oftentimes to try to fix them.
Can you tell us, who was Mary Morris Lockwood?
Well, Mary Morris Lockwood, who lived in Arlington, and lived at the property where a marker now bears her name. I'll come back to that in a moment. She was very active, civically active in Arlington, in the civic life of Arlington, but also in civic reforms. So, for instance, she helped found the library system of Arlington. She helped found the St. Andrew's Episcopal Church, the Federation of Women's Clubs. But she is particularly known for, and the reason there is a marker at the place of her former home, is she was a very active suffragist. And suffragists were women and men who worked very hard, really over a 72-year period, to ensure equal voting rights for women. And she did that, living right here in Arlington, both by setting up chapters of some of the suffrage groups in the state, raising money, lobbying the federal legislators from this district, and marching in parades. And parades was a common tactic to draw attention to the suffrage movement. She marched, for instance, in the very well-known 1913 march down Pennsylvania Avenue, when thousands of women from around the country came. But she's particularly significant because she was one of the so-called silent sentinels, the women who stood in front of the White House every day for a year in 1917, holding banners saying, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?" And they were trying to, of course, influence President Woodrow Wilson to support a constitutional amendment. It took him a while, but he ultimately did do that. It did pass the Congress finally. It did get ratified in the states, and so in fact the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920, giving women the constitutional right to vote. But it was a hard-fought fight right to the end, because the amendment only passed by one vote in the legislature of the last state that could have ratified. And that only happened when one young, of course, male legislator flipped his vote after receiving a letter from his mother urging him to do that. So you can't get better drama than this story of women finally getting into the Constitution. So as a side note to that, these roadside markers are meant to honor and commemorate the many, many people, Mary Lockwood, of course, was only one, who fought for years to get this kind of a right. And it's significant in Virginia because the Virginia General Assembly was completely against women voting. They fought it to the very end. So women like Mary Lockwood, who were going around the state and trying to educate people and get support, are even more heroic than other suffragists around the country because they were facing so much hostility and indifference.
What was Mary Lockwood's involvement in the suffragist movement?
Women had no voting rights for a long time. The organized efforts to get the votes started in 1848. But it took until the late 1800s when some of the states, particularly the western states, started voting to give women the right to vote in their state. And that varied. Some of them allowed women to vote on every race up to president. Some said only the school board race. Some said everything except the school board race. I mean, it was a mix. But there was momentum building in the West, where I guess they could see more easily that, in fact, women were doing all the same things as the men, and so what was the big difference? So there were several, but every state there was a campaign. It took petitions. It took, well, not legal act. I mean, sometimes there was legal action. Sometimes women, such as Susan B. Anthony, actually went to vote just so the result that they expected would happen, which was they were arrested. So women trying to vote were arrested and either put in jail or had to pay a fine. So all of that, there were different groups. It evolved. It splintered somewhat. The women's rights movement started as part of the abolitionist movement. There's a lot of complexity to this story, which I think we don't have time to go into here. And it went in fits and starts. But by the time you get into the 19-teens, more momentum was building, and the pressure from the legislators, senators, and congressmen who were elected from Western states where women were voting started to make it a more sympathetic, Congress. And World War I, finally, when so many women were doing so many things, it became harder even for President Wilson to deny this. So in fact, he did mention that when he finally said to the Congress, you should pass this amendment. So there were women, in summary, there were women in other parts of the country voting before the amendment passed. But just to get back to Virginia and most of the southern states, who I must say were against women's voting rights because, of course, they were against black voting rights. And why would they want black women to vote when they were already trying to suppress the black men? So that was a block that was pretty hard to move. That's why it was significant that it was Tennessee that was the last state. But as I say, finally they got to it. But just to get back to that point about Virginia, if it had been left to a state-by-state action instead of a federal action, Virginia did not change its own constitution until 1952. So this passed in 1920. Some of the states had been voting since 1910. If every state had been left to do it on their own, those of us who live in Virginia would have waited a whole lot longer. So it's quite a wonderful story, and there's so many people who contributed, and many of their stories have not been told, but increasingly there is an effort, such as these roadside markers, to tell those stories. So I'm happy to tell you about it.